In 2020, I started to literally move every dollar I owned into Bitcoin, my paycheck, my IRA. I even took a $50,000 loan out against my 401k. And 3 years later, I walked away from my job for good at the age of 43. Here's exactly how I did it, and one mistake that I made that you can easily avoid. People normally ask me how I got started in Bitcoin. Now, I had first heard about Bitcoin back at a conference I went to, DEF CON in Vegas. I'd been to quite a few at that point. The first one I ever went to was DEF CON 6, but the first time I heard about Bitcoin was DEF CON 18. It wasn't until next year, though, DEF CON 19, that there was an official talk about Bitcoin for the first time, at least that I can recall. It was a talk by Daniel, actually. It was his first time being at DEF CON, which was also the last year I went. But back then, I was more interested in the technology, how it worked, the cryptography. I didn't care at all about the end the Fed narrative, the divest from the dollar, the crowds that were pushing that were the hippies, the psychedelic users, the early libertarians, totally different from today's libertarians. And to be honest, I missed out pretty big. This bias kept me from getting into Bitcoin financially and kept me only interested in the technology. Then fast forward to 2017, 2018. This is when I really consider myself starting to get into Bitcoin, but I still wasn't serious about it. It was on a gambling site, Bodog. I think they rebranded themselves to Bovada. And then they had an option when you made deposits to get a bonus in. If you made a deposit with Bitcoin, you got a bonus. So how it worked is like I would spend about $50 a year, make a deposit, and then I'd make $1 bets on different football games or baseball games, sometimes live betting, like will there be a first down on this drive? $1 here, $1 there. And eventually by the end of the season, sometimes halfway through the season, I'd be wiped out, like most people that bet and gamble. But it was $50 a year. However, if I used Bitcoin as my deposit, they would double it. So I signed up for Coinbase, deposited $50, bought Bitcoin, and immediately transferred it off onto the website and had $100 to gamble with. And I did that like 2 or 3 times and ended up losing it all like normal. But I had started buying some Bitcoin on the side because of this. Saw how volatile it was moving pretty quick, and it pretty quickly, at a moment's notice, crashed down to like 300 some dollars because it had 1,000 and went down to about 300. And that was towards the end of 2017, beginning of 2018, when that particular bull run market had ended and we started the big drawdown for the bear market, the season where it drops. And I just kind of forgot about it until 2020 came around. That's when I had a big shift. A lot changed for me in 2020. In 2020, I got to think about investments, money, and what I was doing. Like a lot of people, the money supply was something that was starting to get on their radar. I looked at my IRA, my stock portfolio, which I'd started roughly in 2004, maxed up my Roth IRA contributions every year. And at that point had invested, in 2020, I think I was at 8 or 9 different companies, stocks. And I was doing better than Warren Buffett. I had a compound annual growth rate of 14%, something Warren Buffett can't even do. It's like a pat on the back. Good job, Sean. But I had learned that the real inflation rate was actually different than the manipulated CPI that any government, any administration would put out there. And at that point, it felt like real inflation was close to 14%. Now, understand, I wasn't living paycheck to paycheck, but I most certainly did not feel like I was getting ahead, even remotely. And it turns out, when I looked at those numbers and those results, I was barely keeping up with true inflation and the debasement of the currency. So I needed to make a change. And Bitcoin was it. I thought about it. I had studied it real briefly, but I poured into it in 2020 and made 4 big decisions, 4 big moves. So here's what I did. I decided that I wanted to move 90% of all my liquid assets into Bitcoin, not into cash, but into Bitcoin. Now, for me, liquid assets, I define as something that I could easily get into cash or is in cash already. So both my bank accounts, so the savings, checkings. I did include 401k in there. That's probably something a lot of people don't consider liquid. And we'll talk about that actually with one of my other moves. But my IRA, all my stocks, I could easily sell those and get cash if I needed to. All that could be converted pretty quickly if I needed the money. So I considered all that as part of my liquid assets. So all that combined, my goal was to get that to 90% Bitcoin, less than 10% of it in cash, because I knew the cash was going to get debased. The buying power was going to drop. So I wanted less of that and keep Bitcoin as my reserve asset. Then I made a real big move, because that took a while. It wasn't until 2023 that I surpassed that 90% mark. I started to move things over, and it took some time. But the second move was in 2021. I decided to sell every stock I had in my IRA and rolled it over to another Roth IRA, 100% of it for Bitcoin. Now, I had used iTrustCapital. I'll have a referral link down at the bottom. They're a good company. I like them. I trust them. But back then, there weren't as many options as there are today. Today, there's quite a few options you can use. You don't have to use iTrustCapital. There's literally dozens you can use. I used them, rolled it all over, which dollar for dollar meant I didn't lose anything. There was no tax hit. There's no burden. It was still tax sheltered. So it just basically rolled all over. But the action was selling stocks, something I rarely did. I was a buy and hold guy. I would research companies, I would buy the stock, and I would anticipate holding it for at least minimum 10 years. I would research about the management company that was running it. I would look at the market they're in. Normally they were a niche market or some kind of breakthrough company, like a rule breaker. And then I would read the 10Ks, the 10Qs. I mean, it was a lot of work, and that's why I kept my portfolio, tried to keep it around 8 companies. I think I got up to 12 or 13 at one point, dialed it back a little bit, but rarely sold. So that was a big move. That was the first time I actually went through with some kind of action that this is getting real. And then 2022 came around, and the bear market was back. So I couldn't sell my 401k because I was still employed. And it's no different than most people's 401k plans when it's tied to an employer. There's not a lot of options, right? They're generally not good investment vehicles. If you're curious about that, ask me why. I have a couple of videos on that too, in fact. But I can't access my whole 401k until I'm really old. And even then, a lot of it's taxed as income. So it has a high tax burden when you start using it. I took a loan out against the 401k. And my plan had a max of $50,000. So I took the max of about $50,000 and immediately bought Bitcoin with it. 100% of it. The loan that I repaid included a small interest rate, which is only 3.25, which is incredibly small, but it was paid back to me. It was a loan against my asset, my 401k funds, that I basically paid back to the plan, which was me, plus interest, which was paid to me. So it was a win-win. It was a no-brainer. It's something I'd have thought, man, why didn't I do that the year before? But I did it, and it worked out quite well. I want to say Bitcoin was somewhere around 36,000 when I did that. I should have that memorized. It was somewhere around there, 36,000 when I moved that on over. And keep in mind, 2022 is the bear market, specifically the end of 2022 is when the bottom hit. The FTX crash, the Terra Luna issues, there's a whole bunch of problems in the crypto space, Bitcoin too. Although it wasn't Bitcoin's problem, it was companies that purported themselves to be Bitcoin companies. So things went down to 17,000. So that loan had bought in Bitcoin, and that Bitcoin was almost half of what I'd bought in at. But I was okay with it because I knew it was a long-term investment, and I was paying myself back in interest. 2023 came around, and that was the biggest decision. Now, I'm going to back up and say one thing. I decided that I needed to quit my job. I'd been there for almost 20 years. The job had turned into a pretty hostile work environment. People were getting laid off all the time. The company was lying about it. They had called them restructurings or some other things until the layoffs got too big, and then they called them layoffs. They were firing people. The work environment was just awful that people were willingly leaving. And I made the decision I need to leave. But I didn't leave right away. I left in 2023. This single action gave me 100% access to my 401k funds finally. Like most plans, you can't use all those 401k funds until you're old enough to retire, or you sever employment. So if you get fired, you get laid off, or you voluntarily quit. So I immediately moved 100% of that into Bitcoin. I quit. I didn't wait for my employer to notify the 401k. I called them, got the form, filled it out, got the deposit. The moment the deposit hit, rolled that over into Bitcoin. 100%. Now, one small trick is there's a negative to this, right? There's a huge tax burden, heavy tax burden, because not only is it taxed as income at that point, which is a high tax bracket, especially if you've had a 401k as long as I did, and it's a large amount, it gets taxed as income. So I had a huge tax burden that was going to be owed in 2024, and you're supposed to withhold and prepay taxes, or you get penalized when you file the next year. However, there was a loophole. Probably not technically called a loophole, but it's a form that the IRS has for you to fill out. And there's two scenarios which are true where you don't get penalized for not prepaying your taxes. This isn't an episode on how to do taxes. Check online your own research, do what I did, and actually look at it. But at that time, there was two circumstances that would allow you to not prepay your taxes and not get penalized when you owe them later. One is if you withhold, I think 90% of your tax burden for that year. So you're withholding, but you just missed it by like a little bit. They're not going to penalize you on that little bit. That wasn't me. I was wanting to not pay any taxes. So the other is if you paid 100% of your tax burden from the prior year, which I did because I was employed, taxes were withheld. I actually got a small refund, but 100% of my taxes were paid. So I fit this definition. You wouldn't be penalized on not prepaying taxes. You still owe the taxes. I still owed the taxes in 2024, which was a lot, but I didn't need to withhold those taxes. So what I did, I rolled over 100% of those funds into Bitcoin, including the amount that I would need to then sell later to pay off my tax burden in 2024, which worked out tremendously well for me. Bitcoin at that time was like 26 or 27,000 when I quit. And by the time I owed the taxes, it had 2.5x'd. So the money that was owed to the government, I also invested, almost tripled it before I needed to sell some of it to pay off my taxes. So it worked out very well for me. And then of course, the other thing, this is some advice that will conflict with people you ask, especially if they're not in the position where you want to be, or where I wanted to be, or where I am now. People will tell you, don't liquidate your 401k. Roll it over. You'll regret it. It compounds over time. Part of that's true. However, I'm a pretty good investor. I did pretty well. I hang my hat on the fact that I had a 14% annual growth rate return on my investments, which is not easy to do. And it was the best thing I've ever done, is to cash out of that 401k. I think that's a good option for a lot of people, as long as you can invest it and you know what you're doing, which not everybody does. So sometimes that investment advice is good, but it usually comes from, I've had it too, my entire life through school, through growing up, people say, pay off your debt, save cash. Two of the worst pieces of advice financially that I've ever gotten is to pay off your debt and save cash. But also 401ks are a good investment vehicle. Another piece of bad advice. So look into that. If you have questions specifically, you can ask me. I have two videos that I've talked about 401k, what to do when you quit, options that are available. And it's almost always in the best interest to cash out of the 401k. Now, they're not, I'm not disagreeing with people that say don't cash it out and spend it and live off of it. Those are two different things than what I'm talking about. This is my plan. This is what I did, and it worked out quite well for me. Scott, hang on till the end. Anybody else, if you got questions in the chat, it looks like there's a couple there. At the end of the recording, we'll go over that, like as far as a Q&A, but I want to kind of cover just a couple other quick points. One of the things I'm doing now, outside of these steps, which got me to the point of retiring and being financially independent and financially free, is now I'm leveraging my asset to get more money. I'm putting up Bitcoin as collateral, taking a loan out and that loan, buying more Bitcoin with it. I am doing that as much as I can while Bitcoin is still under $250,000 a coin. Right now it's in the 80s. It just dipped below 90,000. I think a couple weeks ago it had wicked all the way down to like 80 or 81,000. That's insane. It's well underneath $250,000 a coin. It's a steal. So I am now taking loans out to be able to buy more. I use Strike for this. I have quite a few other videos. That's where I think most everybody that's following this gets this information from, is my Strike series. But I go through a kind of a monthly update showing the pros and the cons, the gains and the losses, how it works, what the screens look like when you actually do it, what the actual finances end up being, and things you can do to safeguard yourself against being liquidated. I'll have a referral code in the bottom. Definitely recommend Strike. They're a Bitcoin only company. I've met Jack Mallers, the CEO. This kid's amazing. Some of the stuff he's built. He's 30 now. I should probably stop calling him a kid finally. But there's other videos you can look at how to do that. Definitely something I would recommend researching and spending a little time learning about. But there's one big thing I want to mention. Here's some of the Strike screens as far as what they look like for the loan. But one thing that I did that was a big mistake. I can admit it now. It made sense then, but I should have taken my own advice. What I mean by that is I ended up deciding to leave my company after almost 20 years. At the end of 2022, I decided I need to leave this job. I had a bunch of sick time and vacation time saved up. And in my mind, this is a benefit I earned. I earned that and didn't use it and worked. I want that benefit. I don't want to give that back to the company. There's no reason to give it back to a company that was taking advantage of me. So I ended up using as much sick time as I could, because vacation time gets paid out when you quit or get fired, but not the sick time. So I didn't leave my job in December. I waited, used my sick time, got it all the way down to 0.01 hours of sick time before I quit. I felt really good about that. That felt amazing. I had the math worked out down to the minute for the last time I was calling in sick to make sure that it ended at 0.01, because I wanted to use up every little bit of sick time that I earned working at this job before I said peace. I tell everybody never to time the market. I timed my job. Two different things, but the same principle applies. If I knew this job was not one that I should stay at, there's no reason to stay at it. No amount of sick time, benefits, pension, anything would justify staying at a career, at a job, at an employer that you think is unhealthy for you to stay at. Now, it just so happens that had I not timed this the way I did to quit with 0 sick hours, I would have been able to liquidate my 401k and buy into Bitcoin when it was 17,000, because that's where it was like mid-December when I decided that I was leaving. And when I bought into it, it ended up being 26,000 to 28,000. Not quite twice, but I could have had roughly 180,000 more dollars had I bought into Bitcoin and taken this action when I knew I didn't need to work at this company anymore. Versus using the last couple hundred hours of sick time, which amounts to not a whole ton of money, and then quitting, and then buying the Bitcoin. So anyway, don't time the markets. And some side advice: if you decide that you're leaving a job because it's unhealthy to be there and it's not a good fit for you and you need to move on, do it. Even if this was reversed and the Bitcoin price was higher then and lower when I quit, it still would have been the right decision to quit when I made the decision to quit. So that's a mistake I made that I think you can avoid. So the last thing I'll leave with here is, people ask me, is it too late? You got in at X. I've heard this person got in at this amount. Look, there's always going to be somebody that got into Bitcoin before you, especially if you're at zero now. Everybody you hear talk about having Bitcoin has got in before you. Sure, you may not be able to make as much as they did, but that doesn't mean they're making all the right decisions either. The trick is, the key is, the secret is not about when you get into Bitcoin. It's about how long you've been in Bitcoin. Like I mentioned, there's always going to be somebody that got in before you. A lot of them ended up selling too and not holding throughout the whole ride. The key is the sooner you start, in fact, the sooner you start big, that's when the clock really starts ticking. That's when the gains really begin to stack up over time. So if you don't have anything, if you don't have any Bitcoin, instantly, today, just get some. Get off zero. It is easy to get $10, $50, $100 worth of Bitcoin. Sign up for Strike, make a deposit, and just buy it. Just get your feet wet. Get off of zero. All right. We're going to pause the video here real quick, just for a second so I can crop it for the upload tonight. And then we'll get to the questions in the chat. Scott, thanks for waiting. Looks like we got six questions, so we'll get to those in just a second here. So hang on, and we will cut the stream, and then we'll go into the Q&A part. If you got other questions, there's still time to get them in too. All right. All right, Scott. Hey, thanks for waiting. Looks like you have a question that two other people had a similar question, so we'll jump into that right now. Thanks for waiting.